And so today we're doing something really, really informal, and we would love to just engage you in a conversation about research. We're going to provide you 3 vignettes of honest, true stories of people who've struggled or have had success in getting funding, because we know how difficult it is out there for you, especially if you're in the humanities space. There's not a lot of funding opportunities, and yet the college continues, as well as the university continues, to push on the importance of research. So we're here to have a discussion with you, talk with you, share with you, and hopefully make it seem less daunting when you decide to approach research. So our 3 panelists today, for the first is Sharonna, and she'll talk a little bit about her experiences. Then Girija will talk some about her experiences, and then we will have a cleanup hitter, and that's going to be Jess, who's going to talk to us a little bit about his experiences, which are really interesting as well. All 3 of them have different case studies, vignettes that they'd love to share. So I know it's so easy to sit back on Zoom and not actually actively engage in conversations, but this is a conversation that we really want you to step up to the plate and engage in, because we're doing this really for you so that we can all hear from each other. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharonna. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Debbie. And thank you all for coming. As Debbie said, we're really hoping to have a good and engaging conversation. But I did really, before I begin, really want to thank both Darren for all the hard work that he does, and Ayla for being our IV support today, and especially to Debbie for facilitating and for her ongoing support of all the different kinds of research in our college, because that's really key here. And it's a bit of a phase shift I'm taking to understand. I've only been at Drexel for a year and a half, but for me, it's been interesting because my background is incredibly humanistically oriented. But because I study health, medicine, and the body, there are ways in which CNHP is exactly the right place for me to be. But there is a bit of a miscommunication sometimes, or a misunderstanding, or a misrecognition of how social science and humanities oriented research might work, and how that might be a little bit different than traditional science research, bench research, wet research, and traditional scientific methods research. And I was just thrilled that Debbie has been so supportive of this, because as a humanist, it's incredibly important to me to know that the kind of work that I do does have support, and how that might play out, because it really looks quite different. So to just frame the topic a little bit, and I promise I won't speak too long, my motivation in organizing this today was to showcase the lively humanities and social science research in our college. And even though it is a health sciences school, we have a lot of really important humanities and social science research here. And we really wanted to highlight it, and maybe a little bit explain some of the ways that it works differently than traditional science research. And one of my goals is to build a bit of community, also potentially to think toward collaboration, but also just a little bit of translation. How does what we do look a little bit different than what some of the other folks do? And some of those differences might be the importance in my fields of books as opposed to journals. So publishing a single authored monograph by a prestigious university press in the humanities is essentially the ideal goal. Peer-reviewed papers are important and they're valuable. The average readership of a humanities peer-reviewed paper, I think, is 3 or 4. So when you look at those citation indices, and maybe you look at the ways and numbers that a science paper might be cited as opposed to a humanist, how many times a humanist might be cited, those numbers are generally going to be vastly different. And part of that is about the fact that humanists write books, and that's what gets used, and it's incredibly competitive to get your books accepted. Academic presses are not running in the black, so they're become increasingly selective about what they publish. So that's one big difference. Also, when we do write peer-reviewed papers, the idea of an impact factor isn't quite the same. I know that it tends to be the case, not always, in more traditional science research, that you'll maybe think strategically about the highest impact factor you can place your research in. In our fields, it's often more about who the best readership for your essay might be. So I've never really looked at an impact factor. I mean, I have a vague idea of what the top journals are, but honestly, it's usually about what I think the right home for this particular set of research is. Or maybe the most creative home. Maybe I want to reach across audiences, so I'll go in a bit more of a counterintuitive way, but it really just doesn't factor in. And the other piece of it is that grants work, sorry about that, grants work a little bit differently too. What we really need is time, right? Especially in a teaching heavy college like ours. So, but a lot of the grants don't have salary buyouts. In fact, those are explicitly not allowed sometimes in the grant structure. So it can be a little bit challenging to convert getting an outside grant with the assumption that you're getting a sabbatical year. So they'll probably fund like half of a sabbatical year and expect your institution to fund the other half. But really what we need less than overhead funds to fund kind of labs and materials and so on and so forth is just time. And those grants are also competitive in quite different ways because we can't offer deliverables and results in the same way as science research, right? So it's a little bit more about defining your topic in interesting ways than being able to say, well, here are the outcomes that I am expecting to provide. But I want to I'll talk to you a little bit just very quickly about my own experience with applying for grants, and I'm happy to answer questions and share resources on that. But I'll be honest with you, what I mostly need to do my work is a pencil and a book, right? So that's less about when I fill out grants. Sometimes it's a little bit like, well, yes, it would be great if I could get a new computer and I would love to have a research assistant and how awesome would it be for me to travel, right? But really what I need is time to sit down and read like 5,000 books on a topic and then figure out what I think. So in my own grants, a lot of the PhDs in the humanities tend to be fully funded, but I did get a few external grants in grad school. This is amazing and completely true, by the way. So in the States, one of the major granting organizations is the SSRC, the Social Science Research Council. In Canada, the equivalent, where I'm from, is called the SSHRC, which is perhaps a terrible acronym for a graduate student. It's the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So I was lucky enough to be awarded a SSHRC grant for my graduate work. And when I was a graduate student, I did my PhD at Harvard. If you had external grants, because you were fully funded, there was like a whole complicated formula of how much you got to keep. But because Canadian taxes were so high, and the Canadian dollar was so weak comparatively, I just got to keep all of it. And it basically all just went right back. But it was like a nice thing. It was a good experience. One of the interesting things in these fully funded programs is that you often don't have the experience of writing grant proposals, and that's actually enormously valuable because it helps you distill your research in really legible ways and helps you think about how to communicate what you're doing in meaningful ways. So I was really glad to have that experience, and it came in quite handy afterwards. I got some internal funding from my graduate institution from the Center for European Studies to fund a year of research in England. A lot of humanists spend a year in the field, as it were. In my case, the field was, punting along the cam, but I enjoyed it a great deal and also got a husband out of it, so who I schlepped back to Canada, back to the States. Then after graduate school, I had a fellowship at the Library of Congress. That's an amazing resource and often underutilized in the humanities. So they offer many fellowships. They give you money, they give you office space, they give you books, they give you book elves and curatorial support. I cannot recommend that enough. And I did that fellowship because I was doing a bit of a pivot. I was thinking a lot more about visual culture. So I was working in their cartoon collection. And then after that, along the same note, I did a fellowship at the Yale Center for British Art because I was really just trying to buff up my skills in those arenas. And again, I could have sat down with a bunch of books and did it, but being surrounded in those spaces by colleagues who were engaged in that work created a kind of intellectual community that really helped deepen my engagement. But this is an important note that might be also quite different than what some science-oriented folks might be familiar with, is that a lot of the humanities fellowships are residential, which means they want you to come and spend a year at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina, or the Newberry Library in Chicago, or the Center for Social Science Research at Stanford, or the Radcliffe Institute. And while on the one hand, these are magical experiences where you can go and you don't have any external opportunities and your external obligations, and you're surrounded by an interdisciplinary field of remarkable scholars and thoughtful people, it's massively biased against people who have family obligations, people who have caretaking obligations, generally massively biased against women, massively biased against folks from communities with less privilege who maybe have relationships or are caretaking other people in their cities. So the people who tend to apply for these fellowships really represent a very specific stratum of the academy, and also tend to be biased against institutions that can offer funding and support to make up the salaries, because they don't tend to be fully funded. So that's something that we really need to be thinking about a bit more. The other external fellowships I've have been smaller. I had an NSF travel grant. I was an alternate for the American Association of University Women grant. I do apply for a lot of these national grants, this kind of like run of the NEH and, you know, the Mellon kind of, it feels like every year, but really it's only whenever you have a new project, which for me is, you know, a new book project. I don't write a book a year. And then just to conclude, I have been pretty lucky at Drexel. And this is one of the things that really made me feel really kind of accepted and welcomed here at Drexel, even though I was applying at Cnhp for these grants with my explicitly humanistic research. But I did get one of the rapid response grants for the racial biases in COVID. And that was, my project there is really oriented towards kind of experiential historical research. And then I got a Stein Fellowship, which will send me to Israel to do a project on face recognition software at the Israel-Palestinian border. And we'll say that the rapid response paper just came out in Historical Studies and Natural Sciences, and I'm really excited about that. And the last piece that I want to say is, while there is some movement in this direction, humanists don't tend to work in teams or large collaborations, which I think and I think, Girija, you're going to kind of provide a bit of a counter narrative to how that can work successfully, which is exciting. But it changes the pace of publication, and it changes the nature of the kind of grants that we apply for. But I have become a lot more interested in collaborative work myself. And I think that one of the nice things about the Zoom moment, it is both reorienting the possibilities of how we create community and also how perhaps we can collaborate. So with that, I will turn it over to Girija.
I'm going to jump in really fast because that was absolutely fabulous, but there were some really important points that she brought up, and I would love for us to use these as talking points if we have time later. Number one is that when we look at promotion tenure, we look at the formula. Part of the formula has that impact factor. So what do we do for those of you who are in the humanities program and who are doing humanities related research and scholarship? How do we deal with that impact factor? Do we come up with a different rubric for you? And I think the answer is yes, but I think this is an important discussion. The other thing is that she indicated that a lot of the grants that she's applying for do not cover her salary. This is really critical because one of the, again, the rubrics that we're using is if the grant's providing a portion of your salary, then you get download. If the grant does not provide a portion of your salary, it's much more difficult to argue for the download. And what she's indicating is that the types of grants that she's applying for don't offer that as an opportunity. Therefore, she's not getting the time allowed for her to be able to do her scholarship and research. This is a really another very, very important topic that I think we want to cover. Another is that the deliverables for her research are much more challenging. I, on the other hand, could go into the lab, put into something into a dish and have a deliverable within an hour. Your type of research, that's not going to happen. Therefore, the number of papers or the amount of scholarship that you could produce within a year would be completely different than the type that I would be able to produce. And so that, again, needs to be factored into overall promotion and tenure of the formula. And then the last is that she's really sought off for others. There's two pieces. She's really looked for these non-traditional funding opportunities. It's not necessarily going to be that she's going to find fabulous funding at NIH, but that she's looking for these really, she's having to dig. And that's where my office should really be able to step up and help you and start paying more attention to the novelty or the nuance or I guess, yeah, these different types of funding opportunities that might be available. And then the very last thing that I want to say is that she's also indicating that because it's so difficult to find funding, she's turned to internal funding, which I think is really, really important for all of you to recognize. Drexel has beautiful pockets of internal funding, and and Cnhp is eligible for those, and we've done incredibly well whenever we've applied for them. So those are just some talking points, and with that, I'll turn it over to Girija. Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Thank you. That was gorgeous. That was a beautiful summary. I will say I have also been particularly lucky because Jess and I are in the same department, but our chair is incredibly supportive of our research. So, and comes from a background that speaks both to the social sciences, humanities, and sciences. So I think we might be a bit luckier than some of, well, I don't want to compare, but I have actually been able to be incredibly productive in my time at CNHP, and I'm really grateful for that. But I know that not everyone has been in the same position. So that's a little bit of my motivation as well. Anyway, Girija, sorry.
Oh, no. These are all really great points. It's really helpful to hear these clarifications, and I'm listening closely. So I want to say hi. I see some of our doctoral students are here. Catherine, Clarissa. I see Jennifer. Hi, Christine, Zachary. Lots of familiar names. Great to see you. So thanks, Sharonna, for that overview. I like to think of myself sort of straddling, sitting at the bridge between art and science. So there have been times when I have veered off into the humanities part of my work, and then there's other times where I've moved completely into the social science, biomedical aspects of some of what I do. I think a really important piece in all of this is to identify where you sit in the landscape of all the different disciplines. And this can vary based on what you're interested in. So a lot of disciplines kind of intersect in very interesting and unexpected ways. So for example, I'm an art therapist, but before I was an art therapist, I was a designer. I was a textile designer. And between being an art therapist and getting my doctorate and coming to Drexel, I was an education researcher. So every degree of mine, every job of mine has been in a different field, has been in an entirely different discipline. So what I learned over the years was how to make connections between what you're interested in and how you might figure out a way to get it supported. Okay? So for example, I did research on arts and leadership through a Department of Education grant for almost 6 years. And the way we did that was we had to do a program evaluation. It was a multi-million-dollar grant with the School District of Philadelphia and Allentown School District. On the face of it, this is an education grant to prepare urban school principals, right? But within that, I was able to embed and study a piece which was around the role of the arts in leadership. And I think the trick, if this is something you're interested in, you're struggling to find funding, is to figure out how you can position your interest in a way that serves the funder's goals as well as your goals. And that might mean that sometimes you do additional things that meet the grant requirements, but you also embed that which kind of fills your soul and make sure it gets funded. So that's one way to do it. Okay? Another way is to recognize the value of what you're doing. So I love this quote by Mo Willems, who says, and referring to COVID, he said, "Science will get us out of it. Science will get us out of this pandemic. The arts will get us through it." Okay, so do not forget the value of what you are doing. Yeah, the humanities and the arts in general tend to get bashed as unnecessary, but I think my life's work and mission is to demonstrate how they are fundamental to our health and well-being. So therefore, I go for a lot of health and well-being grants, and those are being funded by the NEA. The NEH, which is the National Endowment for the Humanities, does a lot of analysis of artworks and written works. So that was an interesting distinction that was made for me when I once sought an NEH grant. So NEA grants typically support research or things that are interventions or new ways to create. NEH looks at more sort of what does it mean? What are the implications for the human condition? I know there's students here as well as faculty, so a lot of the opportunities, unfortunately, are really geared towards someone who's in a professional role. So a faculty, a full-time researcher. There are student opportunities from time to time. There's travel grants you can apply for. Some of our students have applied and got those. You might apply for Fulbrights. I was a Fulbright finalist last year for a Global Scholar Award. I eventually didn't get it because, of course, I went for the most competitive one. Therefore, my chances went down dramatically. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was happy to be a finalist. So I would say just sort of go for it and expect that you will not get 3/4 of the things that you'll apply for. So for example, I would say my hit rate is 25%. I apply for 4 things, I get 1. Okay. And so most of the time I'm kind of feeling sad for myself for the things I didn't get, but that's part of the deal. So do not be disappointed and crushed when you apply for something and you don't get it. Okay. If you apply for like 5 things and don't get anything, I know that's crushing, but you will every time you submit something, and I believe this in a sort of karmic way, whenever you put out a kind of committed energy into something will come back from that. Okay. Recently, we put out a grant to the Department of Defense on art therapy with pediatric cancer patients. We didn't get it. It was a big grant. We didn't get it. However, someone who saw our proposal came back to us and said, we're really interested in supporting this from a different initiative, much less funding than we had asked for, but they liked the idea enough that they said, what, we'll find a different way to support you. So be open that there'll be many different ways, put out your work, be willing to share it, and go to conferences, reach out to people as much as you can, share your work openly. Let's see. So one difference to consider is that if you go for any federal grants, you will get feedback that's required. Okay, you'll get feedback that will help you improve your work. If you go for foundation grants, you may or may not get any feedback. You might just get a yes or no. And that really drives me nuts because I feel like you put so much effort into something and the least they can do is give you some feedback. But you don't always get that. The other thing I do is I kind of keep my arts and humanities life somewhat separate from my research life. So a lot of what I do is social science. The funded stuff is social science, biomedical. And the things that I really want to do, I somehow do it on my own time. So I know that's not ideal, but I feel like I can't wait for funding for everything that I want to do. So I'm writing a book right now, and that's on me. And it's something I've wanted to do for a long time. I haven't written a full book yet. I've written chapters and papers. A lot of my life is writing peer-reviewed papers. And to respond to Debbie's question, my journal, for example, doesn't have an impact factor. And other metrics you can use, for example, are acceptance rates. That's something you can use in place of an impact factor. So there's many different ways to present and justify your productivity. What else? In general, the work that I do, because there's an expectation of funding, I work with a range of different people. I've learned to work with people. It's taken time. It's a skill you can learn. My preference is always to work alone. But on a lot of these bigger projects, you have to learn to work with people. That doesn't mean that you tolerate things. Definitely, I've learned how to set boundaries. I've learned to figure out really quickly who is going to be compatible and who's not. And actually, the proposal writing phase, I consider the dating phase. So I'm like, ooh, and there's some proposals I've written, I'm like, ooh, babe, I really don't want to get it because I do not want to deal with these people for the next 5 years. So it's this is something to kind of be mindful of. What styles and what personalities can you work with? What can you not work with? So it's really part of knowing who you are, what you want, and how much you're willing to sort of compromise to get to your goals. I don't know if that's helpful. So this is just sort of an overview of how I approach kind of the pragmatics of funding along with kind of doing things that fill your soul. Yeah.
I love it. Thank you. A different take, very, very good, but really great information as well. So really you focus on connections, making those connections. You also value what you do. And that's just an incredibly strong message that we all need to make sure that we value what we do. Sometimes we forget about that. We get so caught up in everything that we forget about actually taking a step back and taking that deep breath and valuing who and what we are and what we do. I think that was a lovely message. You also talked about go for it and that you're about a quarter of the way successful, right? So you put in 4 grants, you might get 1. I think I'm less successful than that, but I've always heard that if you don't apply, you won't get money, right? So it's very true, and this is a difficult game that we've decided to play. That there's a lot of rejection, and so that comes back to your really beautiful message about valuing yourself. You can get caught up in all of the rejection and forget to value yourself. So I think that those are 2 very, very nice pieces of information, and that you follow your passion. You even take your own time out of your day to carve out what you really truly love, which is, for your case, is writing a book. So I think, again, those are really wonderful themes that we can think about as we move forward. So with that, Jess, are you ready?
I'm not sure. We'll see. I think I am, but I'm a bit intimidated to follow 2 such accomplished colleagues. And I was hesitant to be part of this session because I have very little experience with the kind of grant seeking that most scholars in the humanities and social sciences are engaged in now. The only external funding I've ever actually had for my research and writing was almost 20 years ago, and it actually came from the pharmaceutical industry, an experience that, as I'll explain, I'm rather ambivalent about today. So I'm afraid my contribution is to this discussion is just going to be to raise some vexing questions I have about whether humanities and scholarship can really thrive under the regnant model of funding in academia today. But raising vexing questions is, after all, our brand in the humanities, so I guess it's all good. So I want to frame these vexing questions with a parable. It's from the storyteller and theologian John Shea, and it goes like this. A king had 2 servants. One was asked to do something, he did it, and was promoted. The other was asked to do something, he refused and was fired. The obedient servant continued to do what the king asked and was regularly promoted. One day, his thoughts turned to the servant who had lost his job because of his disobedience, and he decided to find out how the man fared. He went to the former servant's home, but found he no longer lived there. He was directed to a hovel at the edge of town. Inside, he found the disobedient servant dressed in rags, sitting on the dirt floor, eating a bowl of thin soup. The obedient servant was disgusted with the depravity to which his former colleague had sunk. If only you had learned to obey the king, he said, you wouldn't have to eat thin soup. To which the disobedient servant calmly replied, if you had learned to eat thin soup, you wouldn't have to listen to the king. Now, I'm not here to make the argument that we in the humanities can or should live in an academic hovel and eat thin soup, but I do think we need to be concerned about preserving our capacity to be effectively disobedient to the king. My ideal of humanities scholarship is critical social engagement, pursuing questions that trouble the foundations of knowledge, power, and privilege in society. This usually means that when critical humanities scholars present their work to experts from other fields, and especially when they talk about ethics and policy, they find themselves arguing against the grain. Critical humanities scholarship does not typically lead to reassuring analyses that readily translate into simple, straightforward solutions, but to some version of an argument that the truth is more complicated, more uncertain, and more dangerous than you think. Do researchers doing this kind of work have a harder time competing for funds? I don't know the answer to that, but I strongly suspect they do. It would be an interesting question to explore, maybe if someone could get some funding to do it. Does external funding blunt the critical edge of humanistic scholarship? Again, I don't know the answer, and it would be an interesting question to study. I do have some thoughts though, and I don't know of any scholars who would consciously let their research be shaped by an external funding source. But based on my own experience, I think the truth may be more complicated, uncertain, and dangerous than we typically think. So it's time to regale you with the tale of my entanglement with Big Pharma. It began when I was a graduate student in the history department, Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, working on a cultural history of Alzheimer's disease. Faculty member on my dissertation committee was a neurologist and prominent Alzheimer's researcher, did a lot of consulting work with pharma. He told me once, sometimes to the tune of $10,000 a day. So quite a different world. Around that time, Eli Lilly, which had Alzheimer's drugs in the pipeline, found the home of Alois Alzheimer, for whom the disease is named, and where he was born and grew up, and bought it and turned it into a museum and conference center. With this neurologist on my committee, I was roped into organizing the first conference that was ever held at this conference center. Might be the only one, for all I know, actually. I should try to find that out. And it was going to be on critical perspectives on Alzheimer's disease. For my troubles, I was flown to Germany on the Lilly corporate jet, which I always remember as the only transatlantic trip I've ever taken where I slept soundly. And I have to say, I actually slept horizontally, which was pretty amazing. So long story short, having a key opinion leader in Alzheimer's research on my dissertation committee got me a few small perks that were quite unheard of for a graduate student in history. 4 years later, I'm finishing a postdoc at Johns Hopkins University, working on turning my dissertation into a book. One of the central claims of that book is about unintended consequences, how Alzheimer's advocates committed to bettering the lives of people with dementia and their families unintentionally ended up promoting a policy agenda that narrowly focused federal funding on drug research. As a result, billions of dollars were spent to develop drugs that provided at best marginal benefit, while obvious needs for long-term care and other supportive policies were woefully underfunded. So by this time, I'm quite woke to the idea that nobody's ever given me a talk about how to manage the ethics of these kind of things, but I'm pretty woke to the dangers of consorting with big pharma. As it happens, one of my mandates on this postdoc was to organize a conference in the medical school. So I proposed to the folks in geriatric psychiatry that we collaborate on a conference on critical historical perspectives on Alzheimer's disease. They love the idea. In fact, they want to make it part of their big annual continuing medical education conference that brings hundreds of docs from the region to Hopkins every year. And of course, it's funded by every pharmaceutical company that has any at all in the neurodegenerative disease market. But I want to make this really critical, I say, including looking at taking a critical look at pharma. No problem, they assure me. So we bring in the most high-powered panel of historians, anthropologists, sociologists, policymakers, and pharma critics from within medicine that I can think of. And it being Hopkins, there's also a reporter from the New York Times in attendance. The results, a page-one story in the New York Times. Minimal benefit is seen in drugs for Alzheimer's. The lead, quote, "The drugs now available to treat the memory and thinking problems of Alzheimer's disease have not lived up to the public's high expectations for them and offer such modest benefits on average that many doctors are unsure about whether to prescribe them." Wow. Hooray, I'm ecstatic. We got the truth out, and I have burned my bridges with big pharma, I think. But a funny thing happens. When I met with the folks from geropsychiatry after the conference, they shared some good news. A number of pharmaceutical companies had made unrestricted educational grants to the department for follow-up activities coming out of the conference, including the preparation of a book based on the conference. I was about to leave to start a teaching job, so the department offered me a grant to pay for a semester of course release to work on the book. So I just wanted to clarify, this is really pharma money, isn't it? And the faculty member said, oh, yes, it absolutely is. We wouldn't have this otherwise, but it's nicely laundered. It'll be a grant from the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, which it was. So I was mightily puzzled, but I took the money. We did the book. It was well received, featured plenty of robust criticism of the pharmaceutical industry. But for years, I wondered, what were they thinking? What was their game? And as I learned a little bit more about how the pharmaceutical industry itself operates, I think I've figured it out. The drugs we were criticizing were fairly soon to go off patent. They paid their billions on them. They were developing a new generation of drugs aiming at a different target. And part of preparing the way for those new drugs was to sow discontent with the existing drugs, which was pretty easy to do because they were crap. But that's, be that as it may, I think it's fair to say we were unwittingly serving the agenda of the pharmaceutical industry. Did it invalidate the good critical work we did? I'm proud of that work. No, I don't think so. But it's something that we ought to reckon with. So does external funding blunt the critical edge of humanistic scholarship? In a way, I would say no. I can honestly say I never got a bit of interference from pharma for doing this kind of work. Yet I'm pretty convinced we also were playing into a game that served their interests in ways we hadn't even thought of. So I guess my concluding statement to bring it back to the parable is be very careful, when you accept gifts for your work. I mean, because the king has agents and strategies that may be very difficult for you to discern. So that's my experience.
Thank you for that. And that was really interesting too, which is it comes down to those sort of research ethics questions, which is, is contractual money or pharma money, can you still do good quality research even though you're getting paid for the research with a very specific outcome that they have, so is it possible still to do good research, or can you move forward if your research findings are different than what they expected, and can you value that in yourself as well as in your work? So I think those are some really fantastic questions. So you've listened to our three panelists, and we now would love to open the floor up to all of you to, ask some questions. I think that you've seen some really different areas, and hopefully we've provided you some thought-provoking questions. So please let us hear from you.
Go ahead, Jen.
Oh, okay. So some of the work that I've done, Girija and I did a study that, I think straddles this line between science and art. And I kind of feel that I've always been in the, that I've been, and maybe Deb too, in that I've been very interested in the physiology of behavior, with the behavior obviously being much more thought of in terms of social science and humanity, and the physiology looking at what systems in the body provide the undercurrent or the unaware what mechanisms are going on that we're not aware of but are always there. And interesting, Girija, you mentioned about the impact factor. Even though the journal we published in doesn't have an impact factor, we've had 49 citations of that work.
Yeah, it has an impact factor now. It's low, but we made it open access, so therefore it's been cited a lot. And so many different ways. Yeah,
I sometimes think citations are much more important than having sat on a publication board. I know how the editors can manipulate the numbers for the impact factor. You know, it's a ratio. So you either deal with how many articles you're willing to accept versus how many articles get cited and all of that sort of thing. But one of the things I'm wondering, so here's my question, is do you think there would be value in an experiment where you use the principles or the conditions of community or free world living social science, but in a more controlled setting? So, and I kind of asked this when I, the dean had the 3-day workshop on implementation science and was made a very strong statement in case that when you're doing, say, implementation science, that you need to have a behavioral theory basis. So I had listened to that, and as a physiologist or a lot more of a laboratory scientist, I'm sitting there saying, well, I don't use theory. But it dawned on me that in a free world setting, that the behavior theory might be taking the place of the very controlled experimental conditions. And I'm wondering how valuable would it be to use the principles of free world experimentation in a laboratory? Do you think that would actually help in translating and implementing the results?
I personally love it, right? I think that's where, we do an awful lot of research that isn't in the free world. And so then take all the findings and then apply them into an actual human being who lives in a situation that is far different than the imposed situation that we put them in when we studied their biomarkers, for example. I'm not sure what the relevance is, right? So I think that the answer is that's really the direction that I think that the research needs to go, is exactly the space that you're talking about.
And I'll put on my history of science hat here, and maybe Jessie has something to offer. This is like a very kind of clear cycle that we see in the way that science is conducted. In my own research project right now, which is looking at the face recognition spectrum, it's kind of in this phase where they sort of clinically define super recognizers, these people who never forget a face, and got super excited in the carceral context to take super recognizers, use them in the criminal justice context to identify people, suture the crisis of face recognition software. And then sure enough, right on cue, there comes the peer review paper that says, but wait, we are taking a phenomenon that was only observed in a lab setting, and we're actually applying it to the world without testing whether or not there are real world implications. And I think if you look at the cycle of scientific development, this is actually a pretty repeated phenomenon of stuff happening in the laboratory context, it being immediately applied because there was this fantasy of robustness around these experimental conditions, and then discovering that actually not only were those experimental conditions themselves a constraint on how stuff gets applied, but actually the experimental conditions themselves are highly contingent upon all of these social factors. So I absolutely support the idea that we need to expand these findings in applied ways, and also think about how the findings themselves are fundamentally constrained by where and how they're produced.
And I'm going to jump in just for Jessie because his cat is so darling.
My research assistant has joined us.
Exactly. I think that what Sharonna said can not be better typified, right? What's what I'm looking for. The best example of that ever is the Alzheimer's research. Right? They went in and they found all of these tangles in the exploratory setting, but the tangles are an artifact of exactly what we do with the brain tissue in a culture dish, right? So then all of a sudden, all of this research and all this money, the pharma money, went after these tangles, but it's an artifact due to the experimental conditions. And so I think we went off on a whole tangent and probably did no good service to the people who are suffering from that ailment. But Jessie, you might have better insight in that.
Well, I mean, if I had a nickel for every time they cured Alzheimer's in a mouse, I'd be a very rich person. So yeah, I would totally endorse all of that. I mean, as a general principle, I think one of the things we do, as historians of science and medicine, I don't see if you agree with this, Sharonna, is to trouble exactly these kinds of issues. I mean, I wouldn't call it a fantasy of rigor. It's real rigor. I mean, it's hard to know anything. It's really hard to know to really know something in a stable, permanent way. And one of the things we see again and again is when you learn something in a lab, it does not necessarily, equal knowing it in the world. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we draw attention to those sorts of things all the time.
And maybe just to heighten that, it becomes really interesting for us to think about what we can know about the lab when things that worked in the lab don't work in the world or work differently. That's actually for us data, right? So this is one of the reasons, at least for me, it's so exciting to be in this kind of setting because it's incredibly productive. And that doesn't mean, and you're right, Jess, I misspoke. It's not a fantasy in that sense, but the constraints of the lab themselves are productive, and useful information. And Jess, I just wanted to pull something up because I happened to find it when you mentioned it. Here's your front page.
Oh yeah, there. I had pulled it up today too. Yeah. Something. If I had done a slideshow, I actually have a to me, the thrill is the placement on the New York Times, right? To get a call from a New York Times reporter, I understand it's very, very thrilling. But I actually wonder who called the Times reporter. I wouldn't be shocked to find out it was pharma. Honestly.
I think this is really great. Yeah, this is really great information. The assumption that, and there is a real hierarchy, right? There's a hierarchy that we are discussing right here in terms of what is valued and whose voices are heard, and especially in these collaborations, art science collaborations. Of course, the science people are at a higher sort of perceived status, everything. I work in a lot of art science collaboration kind of things, and the artists are always like the sort of, I don't know, I feel like we are like the bells and whistles, but the real scholars are the scientists. So, and then there's a whole gender piece to all of this. The sort of male female bias, the different paradigms that are funded. I mean, I've been on reviews for the NEA, and despite all of us on that review panel valuing the arts and artistic processes, if there is a proposal that is an RCT, everybody's eyes starts, if it's between a critical review of something and an RCT, of course, guess what gets funded? So these are like real issues we need to recognize. And I'm wondering if this is something we should pitch more to university administration. Even if these are internally funded efforts, then recognize the value of critiquing and questioning things that we think are absolute truths. There's no such thing. So this is really making me think in terms of how we advocate for what we want.
Love that. And I love what you said about valuing ourselves too. Sorry, Jess, go ahead.
Oh, well, if you had more, go ahead. I can jump in a minute. Well, so and that piece of valuing yourself, this is something that sort of gets me all the time, and that is about the way in which we reproduce a world we are trying to critique. And again, this comes more from my world. I think, Sharonna, you'll probably resonate with this. I'm not, other folks maybe not, but so many people I know, like in whatever kind of particular field they're in, they're oriented around a critique of the alienation and exploitation that comes with that is may or may not be a necessary feature of, but is certainly part of our current stage of capitalism, right? So you have this fairly radical critiques being developed by people who, in chasing endlessly the next grant, are themselves increasingly alienated and exploited. And I feel like there's a very weird way in which people even engaged in you know, very fundamental critique of society are kind of reproducing it in the patterns they're the work patterns they're forced into. So I don't know what you think of that, Sharonna or others, but that's something I worry about.
Well, and one thing that kind of came up here, and Jess, I think you were alluding to this a little bit orthogonally, but to be able to question the king, one of the sacred tenets of that kind of research is really having some level of security in which to do it. And sure, we can say that then you're imbricated in the system, but the system, you know, when you're in universities, you're in the system. That's where the tenure piece or the job security piece becomes so valuable. And CNHP is in a strange transitional moment with that piece, but I think that there is an honesty to a system that allows its own critics. And while there's a lot of critiques to be had of the tenure system, and I have certainly leveled some of them, not having that in place at all forecloses a certain kind of discourse. And I think something that also ought to be taken up, and that does disproportionately affect the humanists in the college and the social scientists in the college as well, just because of historical factors, though I know it's engaged in a process of change around that. Although I did want to, like, just a little anecdote. I don't know if any of you, I'm a bit of a Twitter junkie, and there are all these epidemiologists on Twitter now writing things and like being incredibly frustrated and doing all these analogies and being like, imagine if, you know, you were asked to do surgery and you're not a doctor, but you read like a bunch of newspaper articles on surgery and you did, and then you like felt really, really, really empowered to make really full-bodied statements about surgery and actually to go in and cut someone. And all these epidemiologists are like, that's how we feel with all of this armchair epidemiology. And they're so frustrated. And I totally get it. And like, you know, 500 years worth of humanists are like, oh, please tell me what that's like. You know, like for the first time ever, the scientists are like, oh, wait, we're actually experts and we need to sort of justify that. And there is this kind of sense in, like, on the one hand, I think the humanities and social sciences are really open to dismantling certain kinds of hierarchies that imagine you need to be trained in particular kinds of ways and so on and so forth. But also there are methodologies and systems that we have learned about how to do this.
Well, I think one of the things that, slightly different topic, but one of the things I think is interesting in terms of how we train, say, doctoral scientists as compared to, say, training physicians or lawyers, is that it appears to me that there's a greater emphasis on the history and precedence of the field included in the medicine and law, where in science, you know, we tend to focus on the last 5 to 10 years when we're putting our references together or our bibliographies and looking at all right, what did somebody do to publish 2 years ago? So I've got to come up with something slightly different. And I think the students miss out in not having the historical precedence of where the thoughts and where the approaches come. I don't know, what do you think, Deb, as a scientist?
Absolutely. If it predated PubMed, it doesn't exist, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's there. Some of those classic experiments tell us so much more about the physiology of what they were exploring. They're amazing, especially looking at brain interrogation and how it connects with food. They were incredible experiments, but they predate PubMed. They're not cited, and I think that's a travesty. Yeah.
Even in PubMed, you know, you rarely are citing papers from the 70s or the 80s. You know, I think Jess had his hand up.
Oh no, please. I want to jump in afterwards, but go ahead and finish your point.
Yeah, no, I just, you know, I think that not even for the specifics, you know, the real scientific detail, but the thought process of how to put, and you and I know this because of of our workshop that we gave last term on research thinking, but how to assemble thoughts and how to assemble an argument. I have a colleague over in the Klein School of Law, and she and I talk about this all the time, and I'm really impressed with how the legal profession trains their students to assemble an argument. And a lot of it has to do with precedence.
I love that point and agree. And I think that is what we do, you know, what we aim to do in humanities history certainly is to focus on the construction of arguments. Deb, regarding the it doesn't exist if it's not in PubMed story, I can't resist, if you'll forgive one more anecdote that goes back to my Hopkins days. The librarian in charge of the historical collection there told me the story of a lawsuit that occurred because they had this was you know, around 2000 when online was well established, but you know, you still had a lot of paper around. You go into that library now, it's literally empty shelves. It's insane. But they had removed the full copy of the Index Medicus, which is the most thorough index going back, because students were, you know, you just do online searches now, it's in PubMed. But it only went back to like 60 something. Someone missed an allergic reaction that was in the literature from prior to this. The hospital was sued because it was well established in the medical literature, but the student, the resident who went to check it just went online, PubMed. There wasn't even any paper in the library around to search, do a more thorough search. And the suit, I don't know the outcome of it. She didn't really tell me the outcome of the suit, but it rattled them so much that they put those the Index Medicus back on the shelves, so that, and you know, yeah.
I know we have to go, but there's so many things I want to say about that.
I remember using Index Medicus when I was getting my doctorate, and having, you know, you have to wait 6 months for it to be updated.
Oh, right.
And you're
yeah,
you're always hoping that that you wouldn't find something in the Index Medicus that you were trying to do for your dissertation.
Yeah.
Sharonna, go for it, because I'm going to have to jump to another meeting. I'm so sorry, but I'm really.
Okay, well, I'm gonna just thank everybody for coming. I think this was a fascinating discussion. I personally have like 50 things I want to talk to everybody about, but I really appreciate you all coming and helping build this community. And once again, so much thanks to Darren and Deb and Ayla, but particularly to Deb for continuing, and my chair, Christine, for continuing to support this research and helping us forge a path at CNHP to make sure that this is also kind of a part of the broader conversation of nursing and health professions. So thank you all for coming.
And thank you again for organizing it.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.